The autumn wind carried a chill that cut through Martha's thin shawl as she walked to the well behind the house. 6 months of marriage to Thomas Whitmore had aged her beyond her years. Her hands, once soft despite their calluses, were now cracked and raw from constant work in harsh lye soap and cold water. But it was the changes that couldn't be seen that worried her most. The way she flinched when doors slammed unexpectedly, how she measured every word before speaking, the constant knot of anxiety in her stomach. Thomas's cruelty had escalated since the incident with Jake's visit. He seemed determined to break whatever spirit she had left, finding new ways to humiliate her both in private and in public. Just last week, he had criticized her appearance so harshly in front of his friends that one of them had actually looked uncomfortable. Martha drew water from the well with mechanical movements, her mind elsewhere. She had begun to notice things about her husband that she had missed in those early, overwhelming weeks of adjustment. The way he counted his money obsessively each night. How he treated everyone with barely concealed contempt, regardless of their station. The strange visitors who came to the house late at night for hushed conversations in his study. Most disturbing of all was what she had overheard 3 nights ago when she couldn't sleep and had gone downstairs for a glass of milk. Thomas had been in his study with 2 men she didn't recognize, and their conversation had made her blood run cold. "The railroad survey is definite," one of the men had asked. "Absolutely," Thomas had replied. "The line will run right through Morrison's property and the old Henderson place. The railroad company is offering good money, but only if they can get clear titles to the land. And Morrison doesn't know? He has no idea. The fool thinks his cattle ranch might actually succeed. Meanwhile, his mother's medical bills are mounting, and he's too proud to ask for help. It won't be long before he has no choice but to sell. What about the Henderson widow? I heard she's been refusing all offers." Martha had pressed closer to the door, her heart pounding. The Henderson place was the small farm next to Jake's ranch where an elderly widow lived alone. "Mrs. Henderson is proving more stubborn than expected," Thomas had said with obvious irritation. "But she's old and frail. A few more accidents around her property, and she'll be glad to sell to someone who can protect her investment." The casual mention of orchestrated accidents had sent Martha fleeing back to her room, her mind reeling. Thomas wasn't just cruel. He was actively working to destroy Jake and an innocent old woman for his own financial gain. Now, as she carried the water back to the house, Martha wrestled with what she had learned. She had no proof of Thomas's schemes, and even if she did, who would believe the word of a desperate mail-order bride against that of a respected businessman? But she couldn't stand by and watch while Thomas destroyed Jake's dreams and threatened an elderly woman. Her chance came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Thomas announced that he would be traveling to the county seat on business and would be gone for 2 days. "I trust you can manage the household without burning it down in my absence," he said with his usual sarcasm. As soon as his carriage disappeared down the lane, Martha began planning. She had to warn Jake about Thomas's schemes, but she also had to be careful. If Thomas discovered her interference, the consequences would be severe. The next morning, Martha packed a small basket with bread and preserves, the kind of gift a neighborly woman might bring to someone who was struggling. If anyone saw her visiting Jake's ranch, she would claim she was simply being Christian in her charity toward a man whose mother was ill. The 5-mile walk to the Broken Arrow Ranch took her nearly 2 hours. Martha had never been this far from town on foot, and by the time she reached Jake's property line, her feet were sore and her skirts muddy from the rough trail. But the sight of the ranch in the distance gave her courage to continue. The Broken Arrow was smaller than she had expected, but it was clearly the product of honest labor and careful planning. The house was modest but well-built, with a covered porch and flower boxes that spoke of a woman's touch. The barn and corrals were in good repair, and she could see cattle grazing in the distant pastures. Jake emerged from the barn as she approached, his face registering surprise and concern when he saw her walking up his lane. He was dressed in work clothes, denim pants, a flannel shirt, and boots caked with mud, but he carried himself with the same quiet dignity she remembered. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, hurrying to meet her. "What are you doing out here? Is everything all right?" Martha held up the basket, her prepared excuse ready. I brought some things for your mother. I heard she's been poorly, and I thought perhaps some fresh bread might be welcome. Jake's eyes searched her face, clearly sensing there was more to her visit than charity. That's very kind of you, ma'am. But this is a long way to walk. How did you get here? I walked, Martha admitted. Thomas is away on business, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to visit. You walked 5 miles. Jake's voice was incredulous. Ma'am, that's not safe. What if something had happened to you on the trail? His genuine concern for her safety was so different from Thomas's complete indifference that Martha felt tears prick her eyes. I needed to see you, she said simply. There are things you need to know. Jake's expression grew serious. Come up to the house then. Mother will want to thank you for the bread, and we can talk properly. The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and quilts that spoke of modest prosperity. Jake's mother, Sarah Morrison, was a small woman in her 60s who greeted Martha with genuine warmth despite her obvious frailty. How wonderful to have a visitor, Sarah said from her bed near the window. Jake doesn't get nearly enough company, and neither do I. Please, sit, and tell me about yourself. Martha spent a few minutes making polite conversation with Sarah, who was clearly starved for female companionship. Despite her illness, the older woman had a sharp mind and a kind heart, and Martha found herself genuinely enjoying their chat. But, all the while, she was acutely aware of Jake's presence and the urgent information she needed to share with him. Finally, Sarah grew tired and dozed off in her chair by the window. Jake gestured for Martha to follow him out to the porch where they could talk without disturbing his mother. Now, he said quietly, what's this really about? Martha took a deep breath and told him everything she had overheard. Thomas's plan to force him off his land, the railroad survey, the threats against Mrs. Henderson. Jake's face grew darker with each revelation, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I should have known, he said finally. The railroad company approached me 6 months ago about selling, but their offer was far below what the land is worth. When I refused, they said they'd be in touch with a better offer, but I never heard from them again. Because they're waiting for you to fail on your own, Martha said. Thomas thinks your mother's medical bills, and the pressure of the failing ranch will force you to sell eventually. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the cattle grazing peacefully in his pastures. He's not wrong about the financial pressure, he admitted. Mother's stroke cost us most of our savings, and the last 2 cattle drives didn't bring what I'd hoped. I've been thinking about taking a job in town to help make ends meet. That's exactly what Thomas is counting on, Martha said urgently. He wants you to give up on the ranch so he can buy it cheap and sell it to the railroad for a huge profit. And Mrs. Henderson? I don't know what kind of accidents he's planning, but it sounded serious. She lives alone out there with no one to help her. If Thomas is willing to threaten an elderly woman, Martha didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood the implications. I have to warn her, Jake said, and I need to figure out how to fight this. Thomas has money and influence, and I have neither. You have something he doesn't, Martha said quietly. What's that? Integrity. People in this town respect you, Jake. They may not have much money to offer, but they know the difference between a good man and a greedy one. Jake looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. How do you do that? Do what? See the good in people even when everything around you is dark. After what you've been through with Thomas. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implied reference to her marriage troubles. I have to believe there's still good in the world, or I'd go mad. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Martha knew she should start back toward town soon, but she was reluctant to leave this place where she felt safe and valued. Mrs. Whitmore, Jake said finally, can I ask you something personal? Martha nodded, though her heart began to beat faster. Are you happy? I know it's not my business, but I can't help worrying about you. Every time I see you in town, you look a little more worn down. The simple question, asked with such obvious concern, broke through the careful barriers Martha had built around her emotions. Before she could stop herself, tears were streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she gasped, trying to wipe her eyes. I shouldn't burden you with my problems. You're not burdening me, Jake said gently. You're the one who came all this way to warn me about Thomas's schemes. The least I can do is listen if you need to talk. So Martha found herself telling him everything. The constant criticism, the way Thomas treated her like a servant rather than a wife, the growing fear that had become her constant companion. Jake listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. "You can't stay with him," he said finally. "This isn't marriage, Martha. It's slow torture." The use of her first name sent a shock through her system. No one had called her anything but Mrs. Whitmore or woman for months. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "No money, no family, no means of supporting myself. Thomas may be cruel, but he provides for me. There are other ways to survive than selling your soul," Jake said fiercely. Then, more quietly, "I'm sorry. I have no right to judge your choices. I just hate seeing you suffer. You're the only person who's shown me any kindness since I arrived in Clearwater," Martha said. "Sometimes I think if it weren't for knowing there are still good people like you in the world, I might just give up entirely." Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with himself about something. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Martha, what I'm about to say might be improper, but I need to say it anyway. You deserve better than what Thomas gives you. You deserve to be cherished and protected and valued for the remarkable woman you are. And if there's ever anything I can do to help you, anything at all, you just need to ask." Martha felt her heart flutter in her chest. She had never had a man speak to her with such respect and caring, and the contrast to Thomas's cruelty was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." As the sun began to set, Jake insisted on hitching up his wagon to drive Martha back to town. "I won't have you walking that trail in the dark," he said firmly. "And don't worry about explaining the ride to Thomas. I'll let you off at the edge of town where no one will see." The ride back was both wonderful and torturous for Martha. Sitting beside Jake on the wagon seat, she was acutely aware of his presence, the steady competence with which he handled the reins, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings to ensure their safety, the gentle consideration he showed for her comfort. This was what marriage should be like, she realized. Two people caring for each other, supporting each other, building a life together based on mutual respect and affection. The contrast to her own situation was almost unbearable. When they reached the outskirts of Clearwater, Jake pulled the wagon to a stop near a grove of cottonwood trees that would hide them from any observers in town. "I want you to promise me something," he said, turning to face her in the gathering darkness. "What?" "Promise me that if Thomas ever hurts you, physically hurts you, you'll come to me immediately. I don't care what time of day or night it is. I don't care what the consequences might be. Your safety is more important than propriety." Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. When was the last time anyone had put her safety and well-being above social expectations? "I promise," she said softly. Jake helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. In the dim light, Martha could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to say more warring with his respect for her married status. "Thank you for warning me about Thomas's plans," he said finally. "I'll talk to Mrs. Henderson tomorrow and figure out how to protect her. And I'll start making some inquiries about the railroad survey." "Be careful," Martha urged. "Thomas is more dangerous than he appears. If he discovers you know about his schemes." "I'll be careful," Jake assured her. "But I won't let him destroy innocent people for his own greed." Martha walked the final mile to Thomas's house in a strange mixture of hope and despair. Hope because she had finally done something meaningful to fight back against her husband's cruelty. Despair because returning to that house felt like walking back into a prison after a brief taste of freedom. The house was dark and silent when she arrived, exactly as she had left it. Martha slipped inside and went through the motions of preparing for bed, but sleep was impossible. Her mind kept returning to the afternoon at Jake's ranch, to the kindness in his eyes, and the gentle strength of his character. For the first time since her marriage, Martha allowed herself to imagine what life might be like with a man who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The dream was dangerous and probably impossible, but it filled her with a warmth that even Thomas's cruelty couldn't completely extinguish. When Thomas returned the next evening, he was in an unusually good mood. His business in the county seat had apparently gone well. and he barely paid attention to Martha as she served his dinner and listened to his boastful account of his various dealings. "Soon, my dear," he said with satisfaction, "we're going to be quite wealthy. I have several investments that are about to pay off handsomely." Martha said nothing, but she thought about Jake's cattle and Mrs. Henderson's little farm. She had done what she could to warn them, but the battle was far from over. Thomas had money and influence on his side, but Jake had something more powerful: the support of people who believed in doing what was right. That night, as Martha lay in the darkness listening to Thomas's snores, she made another decision. She couldn't divorce Thomas. The law wouldn't allow it, and she had no grounds that any court would accept. But she could continue to fight his schemes in small ways, helping the people he was trying to destroy. It was a dangerous path, and if Thomas discovered her interference, the consequences would be severe. But Martha had learned something important during her visit to the Broken Arrow Ranch. She had learned that even in the darkest circumstances, there were still people willing to fight for what was right. And if they could find the courage to resist, then so could she. Outside her window, the wind carried the sound of distant cattle lowing in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Jake Morrison was probably lying awake too, planning how to protect his ranch and his neighbors from her husband's greed. The thought gave her comfort and strength. Martha closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with images of a different life. One where kindness mattered more than money, where a woman's worth was measured by her character rather than her usefulness, and where love meant protection and cherishment rather than possession and control. She didn't know if such a life was possible for her, but for the first time in months, she dared to hope that it might be. And sometimes, hope was enough to keep a person going, even in the darkest of circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to choose between surrender and resistance. Martha had made her choice. She would not give up, and she would not stop fighting for the people Thomas was trying to destroy. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning was all a person needed to change everything. 3 months had passed since Martha became Mrs. Thomas Whitmore, and each day brought fresh humiliations. Thomas seemed to take pleasure in finding fault with everything she did, from the way she prepared his breakfast to how she arranged the furniture. He criticized her cooking, her cleaning, and especially her appearance at every opportunity. Martha had grown thinner during these months, her clothes hanging even more loosely on her frame. The stress of constant criticism and the heavy workload had taken their toll. She worked from before dawn until well after dark, managing the household while Thomas spent his days at his store and his evenings entertaining friends who shared his cruel sense of humor. On a particularly difficult Thursday morning, Thomas informed her that she would be accompanying him to town to help at his general store. "Mrs. Patterson is having another one of her tea parties this afternoon," he said with obvious displeasure. "Half the women in town will be gossiping instead of shopping. You can make yourself useful by organizing the stockroom." The ride into Clearwater was tense and silent. Thomas drove the wagon with jerky, impatient movements that matched his mood, while Martha sat beside him trying to make herself as small as possible. She had learned that any attempt at conversation usually resulted in sharp words or mockery. Whitmore's general store occupied a prime corner location on Main Street, and it was indeed a prosperous business. The shelves were well stocked with everything from farming supplies to fancy dress goods, and the cash register rang regularly throughout the day. Martha spent the morning in the stockroom, cataloging inventory and trying to stay out of Thomas's way while he dealt with customers. Around noon, she heard a commotion from the front of the store. Voices were raised, and she could hear Thomas speaking in the overly polite tone he used when he was angry, but trying to maintain his public reputation. "I'm afraid I can't extend any more credit, Jake," Thomas was saying. "You already owe me $47, and, frankly, I'm beginning to doubt your ability to pay." "Mr. Whitmore, please," came a familiar voice that made Martha's heart skip. "You know I'm good for it. My cattle are doing well, and I'll have the money after the next drive to market. I just need supplies to get through until then." Martha crept closer to the stockroom door and peered through the crack. The cowboy from the train station stood at the counter, his hat in his hands, and his face flushed with embarrassment. He was even taller than she remembered, with broad shoulders that spoke of honest work, and his brown eyes held a dignity that contrasted sharply with his obvious financial distress. "That's what you said 3 months ago, Jake," Thomas replied coldly. "And here you are again, hat in hand, asking for more. Perhaps you should consider finding work that actually pays instead of playing at being a cattle rancher." The words were designed to humiliate, and Martha saw them hit their target. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice respectful. "Ranching is honest work, sir. I've had some bad luck with weather and market prices, but my luck will turn. I just need a little more time." "Time is money, Jake, and you've had plenty of both," Thomas said with satisfaction. "I think it's time you faced reality. You're not cut out for ranching. Perhaps you should consider applying for work as a farmhand. I'm sure someone could use a strong back, even if the brain attached to it isn't particularly sharp." Several other customers in the store turned to watch the confrontation, and Martha could see the shame and anger warring in Jake's face. But instead of losing his temper, he simply nodded quietly and turned toward the door. "Jake," Thomas called after him, his voice dripping with false concern. "Do give my regards to your mother. Such a shame about her medical bills. I hope she's comfortable." Jake stopped dead in his tracks, his whole body going rigid. For a moment, Martha thought he might turn around and say something he would regret. Instead, he walked out of the store with careful, measured steps that spoke of a man holding onto his self-control by a thread. Martha felt a surge of anger at her husband's cruelty. She had witnessed enough of Thomas's interactions to know that he took particular pleasure in humiliating people who couldn't fight back. The fact that Jake was clearly struggling to care for a sick mother only made Thomas's behavior more despicable. That afternoon, when Thomas was busy with a large order from one of the local farmers, Martha slipped out of the store under the pretense of getting some fresh air. She had seen Jake's horse tied up outside the saloon across the street, and she found herself walking in that direction without really planning to. Through the saloon's swinging doors, she could see Jake sitting alone at a table in the back corner, nursing a single beer and staring at nothing. His shoulders were slumped with defeat, and Martha could see the weight of his troubles in every line of his body. She hesitated at the entrance, knowing that entering a saloon was not something a respectable married woman should do. But something about Jake's obvious pain called to her own suffering, and before she could change her mind, she pushed through the doors. The saloon was nearly empty at this time of day, with only the bartender and a couple of card players at the far end of the room. Jake looked up as she approached his table, his eyes widening with surprise and concern. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be in here," he said quietly, half rising from his chair. "This isn't a place for ladies." "Please, sit down," Martha said softly. "I wanted to apologize for my husband's behavior. What he said to you was cruel and unnecessary." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. "You're the woman from the train station. The one he trailed off," clearly unwilling to voice what they both remembered. "Yes," Martha said simply. "I'm Mrs. Whitmore now." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, two people bound together by their shared experience of Thomas's cruelty. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice careful and respectful. "How are you finding married life, ma'am?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly broke Martha's composure. She had been so starved for human kindness that even this small gesture of care made her eyes fill with tears. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, trying to blink back the tears. "I shouldn't have bothered you. I should get back to the store." "Wait," Jake said gently. "Please. You look like you could use someone to talk to, and I'm a good listener." Something in his voice, the same kindness she had seen in his eyes that first day, made Martha sink back into her chair. "It's not what I expected," she said quietly. "Marriage, I mean. I thought it would be different." Jake nodded slowly. "Sometimes people aren't who they pretend to be in letters. You know about that? Small town, ma'am. Word gets around. Folks knew Thomas was looking for a mail-order bride, and most of us wondered what kind of woman would answer that call." He paused, then added softly, "I'm sorry. That came out wrong. I didn't mean to suggest." "It's all right," Martha said. "I know what people think. A desperate old maid with nowhere else to go." Thomas made that quite clear. They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation flowing easily despite the unusual circumstances. Jake told her about his small ranch outside of town, how he was struggling to make ends meet while caring for his mother who had been bedridden since a stroke 6 months earlier. Martha found herself sharing more than she intended about her life before coming to Clearwater, about her father's death and the debts that had forced her to seek security through marriage. "I don't want you to think I'm not grateful," Martha said carefully. "Thomas provides for me, and that's more than many women have." Jake's expression darkened slightly. "Providing for someone isn't the same as caring for them, ma'am. A man should treat his wife with respect and kindness, not like." "Like what?" "Like property," he finished quietly. The word hung between them, heavy with truth that neither of them could openly acknowledge. Martha was indeed Thomas's property in the eyes of the law, with no more rights than his horses or his store inventory. "I should go," Martha said finally, knowing that Thomas would be wondering where she was. "Thank you for listening. It's been a long time since anyone." She stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. "Ma'am," Jake said as she stood to leave, "I want you to know something. If you ever need help, any kind of help, you can find me at the Broken Arrow Ranch about 5 miles north of town. I know it's not my place to say this, but no woman deserves to be treated the way I saw you treated that day at the station." Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Jake Morrison. And you're very welcome, Mrs. Whitmore." When Martha returned to the store, Thomas was waiting for her with cold anger in his eyes. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I needed some air," she replied truthfully. It was stuffy in the stockroom. Thomas studied her face suspiciously, but apparently found nothing to contradict her words. "Well, see that you don't wander off again. I don't pay you to take leisurely strolls around town." The ride home was even more tense than the morning trip had been. Thomas seemed to sense that something had changed, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Martha stared at the passing countryside and thought about her conversation with Jake Morrison. For the first time in months, she had felt like a human being instead of a burden or a possession. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Martha found herself humming softly under her breath. She caught herself doing it and stopped, surprised by this small sign of happiness. Thomas noticed too, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You seem unusually cheerful tonight," he observed. "I'm sorry if my mood displeases you," Martha replied carefully. "It doesn't displease me, exactly. It puzzles me. What do you have to be cheerful about?" The question stung, but Martha kept her expression neutral. "I suppose I'm grateful for the chance to help at the store." It was a change from household duties. Thomas seemed to accept this explanation, but Martha noticed him watching her more carefully over the following days. He had a possessive nature that extended beyond mere ownership. He wanted to control not just her actions, but her thoughts and feelings as well. A week later, Martha was hanging laundry in the back garden when she saw a rider approaching along the lane that led to their house. Her heart skipped when she recognized Jake Morrison on his bay gelding. He was riding slowly, his posture suggesting reluctance, as if he wasn't sure he should be there. Thomas was in town at the store, so Martha was alone in the house. She watched Jake dismount at the gate and walk toward her with his hat in his hands, the same respectful gesture she had seen him make in difficult situations. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in the area checking on some strayed cattle, and I wanted to make sure you were well." It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. Jake's ranch was 5 miles north of town, and Thomas's house was well south of the main road. But Martha was grateful for his concern, even if she couldn't openly acknowledge it. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison. I'm quite well, thank you." Jake's eyes moved over her face, taking in details that most people missed, the shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting criticism, the careful way she spoke as if every word might be judged and found wanting. "Are you eating enough, ma'am?" he asked gently. "You look like you've lost weight." The simple expression of concern nearly undid Martha's composure. When was the last time anyone had cared about her well-being? She couldn't even remember. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then caught herself. Why was she lying to this kind man who had shown her nothing but respect? "Actually, I haven't had much appetite lately. Thomas prefers his meals substantial, but I find I don't need very much." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A woman needs to keep up her strength, especially when she's working as hard as you do. They talked for a few more minutes, standing carefully apart in the garden with the laundry hanging between them like a curtain. Jake told her about his mother's slow improvement and his hopes for the upcoming cattle drive. Martha shared small details about her daily life, carefully avoiding any direct criticism of Thomas, but painting a picture that spoke volumes to someone who knew how to listen. When Jake finally left, Martha felt both grateful for his visit and terrified of what Thomas might say if he learned about it. She need not have worried about keeping the secret. Mrs. Patterson from down the road had seen Jake leaving and made sure to mention it to Thomas the next time she was in the store. That evening, Thomas confronted Martha with barely controlled fury. "I understand you had a visitor today while I was away." Martha's blood turned cold, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, Mr. Morrison stopped to check on some strayed cattle. He was very polite." "I'm sure he was," Thomas said with dangerous quiet. "And I'm sure it was purely coincidental that he chose to stop while I was conveniently absent." "I don't know what you're suggesting, Thomas." "I'm suggesting that you need to understand your position more clearly, my dear wife. You belong to me, completely and utterly. That means you don't entertain gentlemen callers, you don't go wandering around town by yourself, and you certainly don't give people reason to gossip about my household." Martha felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. Mr. Morrison was perfectly respectful. There was nothing improper about his visit. "That's not the point," Thomas exploded, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. "The point is appearances. The point is that my wife doesn't receive visits from single men, especially not poverty-stricken cowboys with romantic notions." "He wasn't romantic," Martha protested. "He was just being neighborly." Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than his shouts. "Let me make something very clear, Martha. If I hear of Jake Morrison or any other man coming around here again, there will be consequences. Do you understand me?" Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. But inside her chest, something had changed. The spark of kindness Jake had shown her had awakened something she thought Thomas had killed, a sense of her own worth as a human being. And once awakened, that sense was not easily put back to sleep. That night, as she lay in the darkness listening to Thomas's snores, Martha made a decision. She couldn't continue living this way, trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying her spirit. She didn't know how or when, but somehow, she was going to find a way to reclaim her life. Outside her window, the wind carried the scent of wild grass and freedom from the open range where Jake Morrison's cattle roamed free under the stars. Somewhere out there was a different kind of life, one where a woman could be valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Martha began to believe that such a life might be possible for her too. The dust from the stagecoach settled slowly around Martha's worn boots as she stepped onto the wooden platform of Clearwater Station. Her simple brown dress, carefully mended at the seams, hung loose on her thin frame. She clutched a small leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the letters that had brought her here. Martha Henderson had traveled 300 miles from Missouri to become the mail-order bride of Thomas Whitmore, a prosperous merchant who had promised her a comfortable life in his letters. At 24, she was considered an old maid by most standards, and after her father's death left her with nothing but debts. This marriage represented her only escape from destitution. The platform buzzed with activity as other passengers gathered their belongings. Martha smoothed her auburn hair, which she had pinned back carefully that morning, and looked around for the man who was supposed to meet her. According to his letters, Thomas would be waiting with a carriage to take her to his home, where they would be married the following day. She spotted a well-dressed man in a black suit standing near an elegant carriage. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with perfectly groomed dark hair and expensive boots that gleamed in the afternoon sun. This had to be Thomas. Martha walked toward him, her heart beating fast with nervous excitement. "Mr. Whitmore," she called softly as she approached. The man turned, and Martha saw his face clearly for the first time. His features were handsome but cold, and when his eyes met hers, something flickered across his expression that made her stomach tighten with unease. "You must be Martha," he said, his voice lacking any warmth. His gaze traveled slowly from her face down to her worn boots and back up again, and She watched his mouth twist into what might have been a smile, but felt more like a sneer. "Yes, sir. I'm pleased to finally meet you," Martha replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way he was looking at her. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Then, he laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound that made several people on the platform turn to look. "Well," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "I suppose you'll have to do. Though I must say, the photograph you sent was quite flattering. Reality is somewhat more disappointing." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had sent him her only good photograph, taken 2 years ago when she still had some meat on her bones, and before worry had etched lines around her eyes. "I apologize if I'm not what you expected," she said quietly. "Oh, you're exactly what I expected," Thomas replied with another cruel laugh. "A desperate spinster with nowhere else to go. But don't worry, my dear. You'll earn your keep. I have plans for you that don't require beauty." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She had prepared herself for the possibility that Thomas might not find her attractive, but she had not expected such open cruelty. Around them, other passengers were beginning to stare and whisper among themselves. "Come along then," Thomas said, gesturing impatiently toward his carriage. "We haven't got all day. I have business to attend to, and you have a lot of work waiting at the house." As Martha walked toward the carriage on unsteady legs, she caught sight of another man watching the scene unfold. He was leaning against a fence post near the livery stable, and unlike the other onlookers who seemed entertained by her humiliation, his face showed only concern and quiet anger. The cowboy was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and gentle brown eyes beneath the brim of his hat. His clothes were simple but clean, worn denim pants, a blue cotton shirt, and scuffed leather boots that had seen honest work. When their eyes met for a brief moment, Martha saw kindness there, and something else, a recognition of pain that spoke of his own experiences with hardship. Thomas helped her into the carriage with exaggerated courtesy that felt more like mockery. "I do hope you're prepared for hard work, Martha. My previous housekeeper ran off with a traveling salesman last month, and the house has been in quite a state. Of course, you'll be doing much more than housekeeping once we're married." As the carriage pulled away from the station, Martha stared out the window at the passing countryside, trying to hold back tears. The rolling hills and distant mountains were beautiful, but she barely saw them through her misery. What had she gotten herself into? The man sitting beside her was nothing like the thoughtful, respectful person who had written those letters. Either he had been deliberately deceptive, or someone else had written them entirely. The ride to Thomas's house took nearly an hour. During that time, he outlined her duties with the casual cruelty of a man discussing livestock. She would cook, clean, do laundry, tend his garden, and help in his store when needed. She would bear him children to carry on his name, and she would do it all with gratitude for his generosity in taking her in. "I trust you understand your position here," he said as they approached a large white house surrounded by well-maintained gardens. "You came here with nothing, and you are nothing. Your value to me is entirely dependent on your usefulness. Remember that, and we'll get along just fine." Martha nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. The house was indeed beautiful. 2 stories with a wraparound porch and large windows that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Under different circumstances, she might have felt hopeful about making it a home. Now it looked more like a prison. Thomas showed her to a small room on the 2nd floor that would be hers until the wedding. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the back garden. "Dinner is at 6 sharp," he informed her. "You'll find everything you need in the kitchen. I expect pot roast, potatoes, and vegetables. Nothing fancy, but substantial. I have guests coming." After he left, Martha sat on the edge of the bed and, finally, allowed herself to cry. Great, silent sobs shook her body as the reality of her situation sank in. She was trapped, completely dependent on a man who seemed to take pleasure in her humiliation. She had no money for a return trip home, and even if she did, there was nothing waiting for her there. As evening approached, Martha made her way to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. The kitchen was well-equipped and spacious, clearly designed for someone who expected to do a lot of entertaining. As she worked, she could hear Thomas in the parlor with his guests, their laughter and conversation carrying through the house. The pot roast was nearly ready when Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Hurry up with that," he said impatiently. "My friends are eager to meet my new bride-to-be." When Martha carried the serving dishes into the dining room, she found 3 other men seated around the polished table. They were all well-dressed like Thomas, with the soft look of men who had never done physical labor. Their conversation stopped as she entered, and she felt their eyes examining her with the same calculating coldness she had seen in Thomas. "Gentlemen, allow me to present my fiancée, Martha Henderson," Thomas announced with mock gallantry. Fresh off the stagecoach from Missouri and eager to begin her new life. One of the men, a heavy-set fellow with thinning hair, chuckled as he looked her up and down. "She's certainly practical-looking, Thomas. Not much to look at, but she appears sturdy enough for the work you have in mind." "That's exactly what I thought, Harold," Thomas replied. "Sometimes function is more important than form. Though I must admit, I had hoped for a bit more of both." Martha served the meal in silence, her face burning with shame as the men continued to discuss her as if she weren't there. They spoke about her like she was a piece of livestock being evaluated for purchase, commenting on her build, her age, and her prospects for bearing children. When she retreated to the kitchen to clean up, Martha leaned against the sink and fought back another wave of tears. Through the window, she could see lights beginning to twinkle in the houses scattered across the valley below. Somewhere out there, the cowboy from the train station was probably sitting down to his own supper, and she found herself wondering what his life was like. Did he have a family? Was he kind to them? The brief moment of human compassion she had seen in his eyes felt like a lifeline in an ocean of cruelty. The next morning, Martha woke before dawn and made breakfast for Thomas and herself. He ate in silence while reading a newspaper, occasionally making dismissive comments about the food or her appearance. After he left for his store in town, Martha spent the day cleaning the already spotless house and preparing for the wedding that would take place that afternoon. Mrs. Caldwell, the minister's wife, arrived at noon to help Martha get ready. She was a kindly woman in her 50s who seemed genuinely excited about the wedding, chattering cheerfully as she helped Martha arrange her hair and adjust the simple white dress she had brought from home. "You make a lovely bride, dear," Mrs. Caldwell said warmly. "Mr. Whitmore is a lucky man indeed. Not every woman would be brave enough to travel so far for love." Martha smiled weakly and said nothing. Mrs. Caldwell meant well, but she had no idea what kind of man Thomas really was. Like everyone else in town, she probably saw only his wealth and respectability. The wedding ceremony took place in the parlor of Thomas's house, with only a handful of guests in attendance. The minister spoke about love and devotion while Thomas stood beside Martha with a satisfied smile that never reached his eyes. When it came time for the vows, Martha's voice was barely a whisper as she promised to honor and obey the man who had already made it clear he considered her little more than an unpaid servant. After the brief ceremony, there was cake and coffee for the guests. Thomas played the role of the happy bridegroom perfectly, accepting congratulations and making jokes about married life. But Martha noticed how his hand gripped her arm just a little too tightly when he guided her around the room, and how his smile became sharp-edged when no one was looking. When the last guest had gone, Thomas's mask of civility finally dropped completely. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, emphasizing her new name with satisfaction, "now the real work begins. I trust you understand what's expected of you as my wife." Martha nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She understood perfectly. She had traded her independence and dignity for the security of marriage, only to discover that the security was an illusion and the marriage was a trap. That night, as she lay in the darkness of what was now their shared bedroom, Martha stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was how her life would be forever. Thomas had made it clear that any attempt to leave would be futile. She had no money, no family to help her, and nowhere to go. In the eyes of the law and society, she belonged to him now, completely and utterly. But even in her despair, Martha found herself thinking again of the cowboy at the train station. There had been something in his eyes that suggested he understood suffering, but also something that spoke of strength and integrity. She wondered if she would ever see him again, and if she did, whether he would even remember the humiliated woman he had witnessed on that terrible first day. Outside her window, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered promises. Somewhere out there was a different life, a different world where kindness still existed. Martha closed her eyes and tried to hold on to that hope, even as Thomas's snores filled the room beside her. Tomorrow would bring more of the same cruelty and humiliation, but tonight, in the darkness, she could still dream of something better.